Welcome to Ideagen TV. Today we have with us Gerton van den Akker, Diplomat of the European Union to the United Nations in Geneva. Gerton, welcome.
Thank you, George. It's a privilege to be with you today.
Well, you know, it's always incredible to have the perspective of the European Union at Ideagen, especially as it relates to the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. And, you know, we have seen the leadership that the EU has displayed on the 17 global goals, and that's incredibly exciting. And from where you're sitting, you have an incredible opportunity, having most recently been in New York at the EU delegation to the United Nations, and now sitting in Geneva in your new role, semi-new role. It's somewhat of a new role, right? Looking at the perspective from the European Union to the United Nations from a different vantage point. Again, still global. And Gerton, as we move into this time, time of instability, let's call it, with a global pandemic, etc., from a European Union's perspective, how have you been able to persevere, to continue operations, and ultimately to hopefully see or begin to see a light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, that's a great question, George. I mean, we all know COVID-19 has hit us all, and that the pandemic is taking an unprecedented human toll. Societies are in turmoil, economies are in free fall. So while we in the developed world are moving to keep families and businesses afloat, many developing countries are risking catastrophe. So what do we need? But in my view, we need first and foremost a working, decisive multilateral effort to support those countries by enhancing global liquidity so that developing countries have the resources they need to fight the pandemic and to work towards attaining the Sustainable Development Goals. And by preventing debt crisis in those countries at risk, including middle-income countries, in fact, we should also engage the private creditors on joint debt relief efforts. We should align global financial systems with the SDGs. We should end illicit financial flows. And we should also rebuild differently and better. So in that sense, I do see light at the end of the tunnel. And George, this pandemic has revealed our global fragility and has shown how interconnected we are. And the challenges of the response to the devastation of COVID-19 must be a final warning, in my personal point of view. It's time for, if I may say so, a new humility in the face of existential threats. And in the recovery from COVID-19, we need, in my personal point of view, visionary leadership based on unity and solidarity, and returning to the old discredited frameworks and systems that created this fragility is, in my point of view, out of the question. And we must, as I said, build back better. Economies must serve people. We must strengthen social bonds. Economies must be founded on sustainability, inclusivity. We should reduce inequality in all its forms, including gender inequality, and we must provide opportunities for everyone. Now, and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which includes the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, they can guide us through these turbulent
times. And that's incredible perspective, of course, Gerton. And the EU has shown to be and proven to be, you know, a leader on highlighting these critical goals as we're in this less than a decade runway into 2030 to achieve the goals. And one of the areas that we've seen most impacted by this global pandemic has been the workforce. How How is the EU looking at getting the workforce back on track? And what do you see perhaps as one of the biggest challenges in that effort?
I think it's fair to say, George, that after a hesitant start, the EU and its member states got their act together. And in fact, the European Commission, together with the European Union member states, adopted more than 400 acts in response to the COVID-19 crisis in the past 3 months. And they basically are all focused to support the member states, to foster convergence, and to preserve, to the extent possible, the functioning of our single market, because that's, as you know, our raison d'être, but also to ensure the protection of workers. Now, the EU facilitated the budgetary action of the member states through easing of fiscal rules, support public expenditure. We temporarily amended our rules on state aid to allow member states to support their economy, and we activated a clause which is called the General Escape Clause of the Stability and Growth Pact, which allows member states to deviate from the budgetary objectives and to increase public expenditures and actually to have more debt. We also created a program that is called SURE, the European Instrument for Temporary Support to mitigate unemployment, which is a clear expression, in my point of view, of solidarity within the Union. And this instrument allows the EU to provide up to 100 billion euros in loans to member states to finance short-time work schemes and also to help protect jobs so that employees and self-employed are not becoming unemployed and won't lose the income. And we also have helped companies to preserve their productivity, to keep their staff, so not to lay them off, with a view to allow a faster rebound when activities resume. And we are currently in that phase of slowly, resume our economic activities. One more thing, basically also to answer the second part of your question. I think one of the biggest challenges we face, not only in Europe, but I think all across the globe, and that's something I'm working on here on a daily basis at the International Labour Organization, which is a hugely important part of the UN family. And that is that we have to, if I may say so, we have to rethink the value of work. We can no longer accept that when we all had to stop and we all had to lay down our jobs and go home, that those who kept the societies and the economies alive are the ones that are less remunerated, receive a very modest salary. And I'm talking about policemen, I'm talking about people that work in to keep storage of goods going, the mailmen, package deliveries, nurses I already mentioned, policemen, you name it. Fairness, in my personal point of view, George, is also part of our social resilience, and that will be a big challenge for all of us in the near future, I think.
Yeah, I guess I'd like to ask you, sort of a follow-up to that, which is, a lot of folks across the planet, because let's see this as something that for the very first time has affected the entire planet. Everyone has had a similar circumstance with stay-at-home orders, wearing masks, social distancing and all the rest. And I think that as we look at resiliency, I think you alluded to resiliency and looking at a new normal. Do you see that workforce coming back in a way that is resilient? Do you see changes in the way the workforce functions based on what we have all collectively experienced?
Yes, I think I do. And I think we have the responsibility to focus on the more vulnerable, and a group that is very close to my heart is the younger generation. And that's across the globe. We all know that the pandemic has hit the younger generation harder than other groups. Let's face it, more than 1 in 6 young people have stopped working across the globe. And I believe it must be our priority in the context of the EU, but I think also in the United States, in the context of the United Nations, to support youth employment from the onset. And the crisis has highlighted that not all people have the digital skills they need for jobs and other areas of life. So that's why we have to invest in skills, in vocational education and training. The EU has done that. We have created this youth guarantee, and if you sign up to this guarantee, you will receive an offer of employment or an offer of education, an offer of apprenticeship or training within 4 months. To avoid any form of discrimination, we want to reach out to those vulnerable groups. We have a special focus on ethnic minorities, on people with disabilities, and also people that are young people that are not living in cities, but that live in remote, rural, or disadvantaged urban areas. And that vocational training will have an impact in the longer term as well, and will be beneficial to all of us because it will make systems more modern, more attractive, flexible, and fit for the digital and green economy. And that's something we all need to work on, George.
Well, and you bring up a good point. I mean, I think youth unemployment, reskilling. We've heard a lot about that. We hear a lot about it here in the United States, and there's a lot of folks looking at that. And I think therein lies some of the key opportunity for governments, the public sector, obviously, NGOs, and of course and to rethink, reimagine, and reinstill that sort of process and obviously the European Union is a model for apprenticeships. I mean, we've heard it many, many times where the United States looks at the EU for these models of apprenticeship that work in companies that help reskill, upskill, and equip individuals to have a really impactful career with this reskilling. And what this global pandemic, I think, is also exposing is inequality, right? In the United States and in other parts of the world, but especially in the United States, the notion of zip code, the notion that everything is layered, right? So you live in a certain zip code, you have a certain level of education available to you, you then have a certain level of public health services available, and on and on. And that shouldn't be, obviously. And I think that's where we look at the global goals to level set that these global issues also include the United States, including poverty, lack of access to technology and broadband, things that we sometimes take for granted, many individuals do not have access to. And so that's where I think you begin when you come out of a global situation like this, to fix things so that everyone has an opportunity to succeed. And that should be just the baseline, right? That you have a basic access to healthcare, that you have a basic access to education, just like everyone else. And I think that's why we believe that the European Union and the global goals, especially those 17 broad goals, should be achieved by 2030. Things like eradicating poverty, eradicating hunger, equality, and on, so that every human being has an opportunity. Isn't that what it's all about? So, with that, Gerton, I'd like to shift a bit to focus more on the goals. So, as I mentioned, the European Union has led on so many levels on the Sustainable Development Goals, those 17 goals. How do you see, or what is your perspective on whether we, during this pandemic, have been set back in terms of getting off course, or are we perhaps in some ways more on course to achieve the goals by 2030?
Wow, that's a tough one. Well, let me start by saying that the task of eradicating poverty and the task of achieving the SDGs has never been more challenging. It has never been more urgent, and it has never been more necessary. Now, you know, the UN is as strong as the member states want the UN to be. But the UN has reformed recently, also because of American pressure, let's be clear. Especially, it has especially reformed at country level, and it has transformed structures, it has transformed tools, funding, mindsets to better advance the attainment of the SDGs to advance the 2030 agenda. The UN country teams in developing countries under the independent leadership of resident coordinators, they are making a greater impact supporting member states of the UN where it matters most in the lives of people than, let's say, 5 to 10 years ago. So that's important. That's an important thing to say in my personal point of view. And thanks to this renewed spirit of collaboration, the UN system is working together more effectively, more efficiently across all dimensions of sustainable development. And that's important because we have to help those countries navigate and accelerate progress towards achieving the SDGs, of course, respecting the national ownership. And the COVID-19 pandemic, George, has raised the bar even higher, because we face, so to say, a triple imperative. First, we have to respond urgently to help countries stem the impact of the pandemic and suppress the transition of the virus. That's obviously something that the WHO is really active on. Then we have to help governments and their people safeguard the development gains, that, you know, the achievements from the past. At the same time, mitigating the socioeconomic impact of the pandemic. That's something the International Labour Organization is working on together with the WTO and the World Bank and the IMF and UNDP, etc. And we have to protect lives in emergency settings, because emergencies, you know, they didn't stop during the COVID crisis. On the contrary. And thirdly, we have to work with partners, including Ideagen, including the private sector, including the business community, including foundations, to ensure that the national, regional, and global recovery efforts to implement the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Climate Agreement, etc., continue. And that's why I'm always so glad to participate in Ideagen events, because I know that you're a force for good and that you're bringing a lot of different stakeholders together.
Thank you, and likewise, we see, you know, obviously the leadership of the European Union on the 17 goals is so inspiring, and I'd like to shift back to a question that we touched upon earlier, which is that new normal. If there's a vaccine, it appears there's a rush to get the vaccine safely to market. Do you see a new normal? Do you see a level set of a new normal? Do you see folks working remotely more? You know, let's start maybe with the EU. Do you see your colleagues maybe working more using our wonderful tool like Microsoft Teams or other types of platforms to communicate? Or do you still think it's critically important to meet in person to get these negotiations done? I know it's a complicated question, but post-pandemic, in a vaccine scenario, do you see things getting back to the old normal, or do you see a new normal?
definitely diplomats need to meet in person to achieve progress, because that's something I am really missing right now. I'm back in the office, but the UN is not really meeting yet, so I cannot meet up with my colleagues from the United States or from India or from Russia to discuss all these all the things that keep us busy right now. So, but what you're basically asking is, and that's not an easy question to answer, but I'll try nevertheless, is what will the world look like after COVID-19?
That's great. Mm-hmm.
Now, George, many of the problems we will face in the next decade will simply be a more extreme version of those that we are already confront today. The world will only look significantly different this time, in my opinion, if, as we emerge from the crisis, if we decide to take action to resolve these problems and to bring about fundamental change. So in that sense, COVID will speed up things, and the world after COVID-19, as we have known it, is, in my personal point of view, unlikely to return. Many trends are that were already underway in the global economy are simply being accelerated by the impact of the pandemic. And this is especially true, and you alluded to that as well, for the digital economy, with the rise of digital behavior, such as remote working and learning, telemedicine, for example, very important development, and delivery services. And other structural changes may also accelerate, including the regionalization of supply chains, the further explosion of cross-border data flows. So the future of work has arrived faster, along with its challenges.
That's right.
And many of them potentially multiplied, such as income differences. There's a word for that, income polarization, I think it is. The vulnerability of workers, more gig work, the need for workers to adapt to occupational transitions, and you mentioned the element of skills. And this acceleration is the result not only of the technological advances, but also of new considerations for health and safety, and economies and labor markets will take time to recover, and will likely emerge in a changed shape.
Well, and it's amazing to see we, as you know, speak to a lot of different people each and every day, a lot of CEOs, a lot of diplomats, a lot of, NGO leaders, et cetera. And what we're hearing across the board, and it's interesting, is that there's an incredible amount of innovation taking place and or being planned to implement. Plans for innovation that were on the agenda for companies, for example, that were on a 3 to 5 year time horizon, are now being implemented in 3 to 5 months in this past 3 to 5 month period. And so that acceleration cannot be turned back. And the inertia for a lot of the status quo in terms of healthcare delivery has been upended, because now you are seeing telemedicine as a necessity, which ultimately could turn into a permanent way of delivering quality healthcare. And so these are positive results from an equity standpoint, because now if you couple that with delivering and providing and gaining access to broadband for communities that perhaps didn't have access to this broadband technology to access the internet, now they can then access the tools, including healthcare, but also education, and on and on. And so I think from that forcing function of the pandemic, we have arrived at a more accelerated pace of innovation. Perhaps not all will be positive. There's always an unintended consequence. However, efficiency is also extremely important, and equity is also extremely important. So combining those two, I think, will result in a better world overall, as you just described. So I think that's a positive. In terms of working together in collaboration. We know that you are a leader in collaboration. You believe in collaboration, not only within the European Union, but with companies, NGOs, bringing together stakeholders to help solve some of the world's most vexing issues. In this case, you're working with the ILO, the International Labor Organization, and you're looking at the future of work. You're looking at the European Union market, this giant market of 27 member states that are trying to weather this pandemic. It's not an easy task. We see that here in the United States. We have a lot of challenges in terms of infrastructure, access, equity as well, et cetera. So what do you see for the future of collaboration? Do you think that's also accelerating?
I sincerely hope so, George. You know me as a true multilateralist. I believe in the multilateral system. It has its flaws, don't misunderstand me. And the UN is as strong as the member states want it to be. I've already said, and we need a strong European Union to make sure that the United Nations becomes even more efficient and effective. But we also need a strong United States that is well represented in the different bodies of the United Nations, and that's why I personally regret the withdrawal from the WHO, for example, because it's, you know, if you want to change an organization, whether it's the UN in general or the WHO in this case, it's better to be part of it and try to make it work, because there are certainly things. There are certain things that didn't go well in the past in the WHO, but there are also a lot of things that the WHO achieved also thanks to the active involvement of the United States. Now, on working together and ultimately, hopefully achieve the all 17 SDGs, solidarity is not easy. Huh? The crisis has shown us that even in Europe, countries in the first instance started to deal with the COVID-19 impact nationally. And very soon we realized that that was not the solution, that the virus doesn't recognize boundaries and doesn't feel restricted by frontiers and closed border crossings, etc. So I think it has been a huge wake-up call. And in that sense, I want to be, but I also am hopeful that this will be a warning sign, that we will, for example, also work very proactively in ensuring a strong transatlantic collaboration, not only when it comes to governments. As a diplomat, I would always focus first on governments and international organizations, but also in the private sector, because there's so much that binds us, the United States as well as Europe, when it comes to human rights, freedom of expression, you know, open societies, and that's what the world needs, in my personal point of view, in you know, trying to achieve those 17 Sustainable Development Goals.
That's right, Gerton. That's incredible perspective. And I'd like to ask you, what are 3 key pieces of advice that you would like to share with our global audience, millions of people around the world, advice that you would give them in order to help achieve the global goals?
Okay. I have a macro perspective. I have a micro perspective, but maybe first to say that, and I sincerely hope that this video will be watched by many people, especially those also in the private sector being interested in the SDGs. Investors, regulators, and more broadly societies are increasingly, how shall I say, demanding greater transparency around the non-financial performance of organizations in order to assess their true long-term value. So, in my opinion, businesses must broaden the scope of their reporting and seek new ways of communication, and that's why the SDGs are so incredibly important. And companies, and that's at a macro level, especially the larger ones, they are facing challenges that limit their potential to growth, such as scarce national resources, weak financial markets, limited local buying power, lack of qualified people, talent. So we see a clear, as European Union, we see a clear business case for companies to harness the SDGs, to create opportunities and to address these challenges across four key themes: growth, risk, capital, and purpose. And all companies stand to gain from more resilient communities as well, reliable access to natural resources, an educated population and a healthy population to support the workforce. And by helping drive progress towards these outcomes and by creating shared value, companies can and should help to secure their ability to generate capital and shareholder value over a long term. On a micro level, if I may, George, I really need to highlight small businesses. They are, in many countries, the backbone of our economies. And these same businesses are at risk of being disproportionately impacted by disruptive events such as fires, floods, because of climate change, cyber attacks. Now, without proper preparation, any one of these events could result in business failures and potentially life-changing consequences for owners and employees. So in that sense, also for them, being focused on the SDGs serves a huge purpose.
Incredible perspective on the business case for companies to embrace the SDGs. I think that is extremely profound advice, Gerton, and very much welcome, and something that I think companies are embracing. We see both the United Nations embracing companies, but also companies embracing the 17 global goals, which is great for the communities, great for the planet, great for the workforce, great for healthcare, great for education, and just all around, just great. Okay, Gerton, if we go back to when you first started your career, not so long ago, but so long ago. We don't want to date you on this Ideagen TV program, but we do want to honor you in the length of your career and your service in your role as a diplomat. So when you first started your career, what bit of advice would you now give yourself if you were just starting, and why?
Well, yeah, we have, and I'm Dutch, as you know, and in the Netherlands we have an expression that somebody has lost his or her wild hair, which in my case is definitely also the case. I was pretty full of myself at the time. I thought, I could save the world. What I would have given myself as an advice is, first of all, to listen. To listen. We're all focused on giving presentations and being eloquent and stand on a podium and sell yourself, to do a pitch, whatever, a sales pitch or an elevator pitch or whatever you call it. But listening is such a great quality as well, especially for young people. To try, and that's especially important in my business, but I think that applies to many of us, and also to those who are watching now, to put yourselves in the shoes of the other side, of the component, of the opponent, of the the person you're negotiating with. Trying to listen in between the lines, what the person is not saying or is leaving out. So that's one. I think getting to know different cultures, different languages, different norms and values is incredibly important as well. And I think I should have traveled even more than I did, although in those days, you know, a long time ago, it was obviously much more expensive and much more cumbersome. But the trips I made and the exposure I got from other people in other parts of the world made me a richer human being, not financially, but let's say experience, when it comes to experiences. So this continuous interest in what makes other people tick, I think, is something that I would have told myself when I was young.
Incredible perspective. Listen, if there's one word that's critical for a lesson for everyone, really, it's to be able to listen. And along with that comes empathy. Because if you're listening, then you're able to empathize. If you're not listening, you can't get to empathy. Yeah, so I think that's a very, very, very powerful lesson for all of us, especially now in 2020, as we emerge, hopefully at some point soon from this global pandemic, perhaps more resilient, perhaps with a better perspective, and perhaps working together to make the world a better place. Gerton, I'd like to ask one final question, and that is, as we now approach this runway to 2030, a few short months ago, you, I, the whole planet had no idea that a few short months later, the entire world would be upended with this global pandemic. We had no idea. And so we looked at January 2020. We said we have 10 years to get to the global goals. We will work hard to try to achieve those goals. And here we are now, again, in the midst of this pandemic. What is your call to action? What is the call to action that you would ask our global audience that watch this programming on Ideagen TV to help achieve the goals by 2030?
3 points, George. 3 points that basically build on what I have said earlier, just to wrap it all up in a nice package. Stronger focus on public-private partnerships. My friends, the footprint of the UN, the financial footprint of the UN, is tiny. We need strong collaboration between multilateral organizations, between governments and the private sector, the business community, but also academia, foundations, because the problems that we are facing right now are too complicated to do it all in splendid isolation. So that's one. Strong focus on public-private partnerships. 2, I already explained there is a strong and clear business model for companies that make it attractive to work towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And you're also proof of that, George. Ideagen and all the partners you're working with are doing a tremendous job in this sense. But the business case is there. Spread the word. Spread the gospel. 3rd point, listen, understand each other better, show empathy. That's not the same as weakness. Show respect in order to gain respect. Thank you, George.
Gerton van den Akker, EU diplomat to the United Nations in Geneva. We can't thank you enough for your perspective, for your insights, for your inspiration as you work toward helping to achieve the global goals by 2030 and helping to bring so many together, including the public and private sector. And we really like what you said about the business case for companies across the planet to espouse the global goals, to do better and do more good. Thank you so very much for your inspiration, and to our global audience, visit ideagenglobal.com for more programming. Thank you.
Thank you, George.